The sound of dirt hitting the wooden coffin lid echoed through the monastery courtyard as Brother Thomas sealed himself into what would become his final resting place. But this wasn't a funeral. This was the ultimate act of religious devotion that would shock even his fellow monks who had watched him live in complete silence for 3 decades. What happened next would challenge everything you think you know about the limits of human faith and the price some people are willing to pay for spiritual enlightenment. Welcome back to History Grandpa, where we explore the most extreme acts of devotion and madness that shaped human history. The practice of voluntary self-burial among Christian monks represents one of the most psychologically complex phenomena in religious history, where the boundary between ultimate devotion and mental breakdown becomes impossibly blurred. These weren't isolated incidents of religious mania, but part of a broader tradition of extreme asceticism that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits in pursuit of spiritual transcendence. The most documented case occurred in the 14th century at the monastery of Saint-Sepulchre in northern France, where Brother Thomas de Montfort achieved legendary status for his 30-year vow of complete silence before voluntarily entombing himself alive. His story illuminates the darker aspects of medieval religious culture, where the pursuit of holiness could lead to acts that modern psychology would classify as severe self-harm. Thomas entered the monastery as a young man of 22, fleeing what contemporary records describe as a life of worldly sin and corruption. Like many medieval monks, he came seeking redemption through religious discipline, but his interpretation of Christian devotion would prove far more extreme than even his austere brothers could anticipate. The vow of silence he undertook wasn't unusual in itself. Many monastic orders practiced periods of contemplative quiet as part of their spiritual discipline. What made Thomas extraordinary was the absolute nature of his commitment and the devastating psychological toll it would exact over 3 decades of complete vocal isolation. Medieval monasteries were communities built around rigorous spiritual discipline, but they still maintained essential human social connections through shared meals, group prayers, and necessary communications about daily life. Thomas rejected all of these accommodations, communicating only through written notes for essential matters and spending most of his time in complete solitary contemplation. The psychological effects of prolonged silence began manifesting within the first year. Fellow monks reported that Thomas seemed to lose interest in written communication, then gradually stopped acknowledging others entirely. He would spend 18 to 20 hours daily in his cell, emerging only for mandatory religious services where he would stand motionless, his lips never moving even during communal prayers. Contemporary accounts describe physical changes that accompanied his mental transformation. His hair turned completely white within 5 years, despite his young age. His weight dropped dramatically as he began refusing most food, surviving on water and occasional pieces of bread. Most disturbing to his fellow monks, his eyes developed what they described as a distant, otherworldly stare that seemed to look through rather than at people. The monastery's records, meticulously kept by successive abbots, document Thomas's gradual withdrawal from all human contact. By his 10th year of silence, he had stopped attending communal meals entirely. By the 15th year, he rarely left his cell except for the most essential religious obligations. Other monks reported that his presence had become deeply unsettling, as if he were already more spirit than flesh. The theological questions raised by Thomas's behavior created divisions within the monastery community. Some brothers viewed his extreme devotion as evidence of special holiness and divine favor. Others worried that his behavior had crossed the line into spiritual pride or even possession by demons. The abbot struggled to balance respect for religious freedom with concern for Thomas's mental and physical health. During his 20th year of silence, Thomas began exhibiting behaviors that alarmed even his most supportive brothers. He would spend entire nights standing motionless in the monastery chapel, his arms spread in crucifixion pose, occasionally bleeding from what appeared to be self-inflicted wounds on his palms and feet. Some monks reported seeing him levitating during prayer, though these claims were likely products of sleep deprivation and religious hysteria. The decision to bury himself alive came after Thomas broke his 30-year silence with a single written message left on the altar. "I have heard the voice of God calling me to join him in the earth as Christ was buried before his resurrection. I go willingly to my wedding with eternity." The note was the first communication anyone had received from him in over a decade. The monastery faced an unprecedented theological and practical crisis. Canon law prohibited suicide, but Thomas argued that his act was voluntary martyrdom in imitation of Christ's death and burial. He had spent months preparing a wooden coffin in his cell, complete with air holes and a small supply of communion wafers. His plan was methodical and showed clear evidence of long-term planning rather than sudden religious mania. The abbot convened a council of senior monks and visiting theologians to debate the theological implications. Some argued that Thomas's extreme devotion represented the highest form of Christian sacrifice. Others contended that such acts violated God's commandment against taking one's own life. The debate raged for weeks, while Thomas waited calmly in his cell, occasionally leaving additional written notes expressing his unwavering determination. The burial ceremony itself became a mixture of funeral rite and religious celebration that attracted monks from monasteries across France. Thomas appeared serene and purposeful as he climbed into his wooden coffin, clutching a crucifix and wearing the simple brown robes he had worn for 30 years. His final written message, read aloud by the abbot, expressed forgiveness for all who had doubted his calling and promised to pray for the monastery from beyond the grave. The psychological mechanics of Thomas's 3-decade journey toward self-burial reveal the devastating effects of extreme social isolation combined with religious obsession. Modern psychologists recognize patterns consistent with severe depression, social anxiety disorder, and what might now be classified as religious OCD or scrupulosity, an obsessive concern with religious purity that can lead to increasingly extreme behaviors. The monastery's records describe the eerie silence that followed Thomas's burial. Brothers reported feeling his absence more powerfully than they had felt his presence during his final years of life. Some claimed to hear faint sounds of prayer emanating from his burial site, though these were likely products of grief and guilt rather than supernatural phenomena. The theological aftermath of Thomas's self-burial created lasting controversy within the Catholic Church. Progressive theologians used his case to argue for better pastoral care and mental health support for monks experiencing psychological crises. Conservative voices maintained that his extreme devotion, while misguided, demonstrated admirable commitment to Christian principles. Similar cases appeared throughout medieval Europe, suggesting that Thomas's behavior wasn't entirely unique. The records of other monasteries describe monks who engaged in extreme forms of self-denial, prolonged silence, and voluntary confinement that sometimes led to death. These cases reveal a dark undercurrent within medieval religious culture, where the pursuit of holiness could become indistinguishable from self-destruction. The broader historical context reveals that extreme asceticism was often encouraged by religious authorities who viewed physical suffering as evidence of spiritual advancement. The line between holy suffering and pathological self-harm was rarely clearly defined, leaving vulnerable individuals like Thomas to interpret religious teachings in increasingly destructive ways. Modern psychiatric understanding provides insight into how prolonged social isolation can trigger severe mental health deterioration. Thomas's gradual withdrawal from human contact, combined with malnutrition and sleep deprivation, created ideal conditions for the development of psychosis, severe depression, and distorted thinking patterns that culminated in his decision to bury himself alive. The monastery of Saint-Sepulchre eventually became a pilgrimage site where visitors would pray at Thomas's grave, seeking intercession for their own spiritual struggles. The Catholic Church never officially recognized him as a saint, but local veneration persisted for centuries, reflecting popular fascination with extreme religious devotion, regardless of official theological approval. The physical evidence of Thomas's 30-year ordeal remained visible to his fellow monks long after his death. His cell, preserved exactly as he had left it, contained hundreds of religious texts covered in microscopic handwritten notes and prayers. The walls were covered with scratches and gouges where he had carved religious symbols and biblical verses during his long hours of solitary confinement. Archaeological investigation of similar monastic sites has revealed evidence of other monks who engaged in extreme forms of self-denial and isolation. These discoveries suggest that Thomas's case, while exceptional in its documentation and ultimate outcome, was part of a broader pattern of religious extremism that flourished in medieval monastic communities. The psychological profile that emerges from contemporary accounts suggests a man who gradually lost contact with reality, while maintaining the outward appearance of religious devotion. His transformation from seeking monk to living ghost reveals how religious communities sometimes enabled rather than treated severe mental illness when it appeared to serve spiritual purposes. The legacy of Brother Thomas extends beyond his individual tragedy to illuminate broader questions about the relationship between religious devotion and mental health. His story serves as a cautionary tale about how spiritual seeking can become pathological when combined with social isolation, inadequate psychological support, and cultural encouragement of extreme self-denial. Today, mental health professionals recognize that religious environments can sometimes exacerbate rather than heal psychological trauma, particularly when extreme behaviors are interpreted as signs of special holiness rather than cries for help. Thomas's 30-year journey toward self-destruction demonstrates how easily the pursuit of transcendence can become a flight from life itself. The dirt that covered Thomas's coffin has long since settled into indistinguishable earth, but the questions raised by his extreme devotion continue to resonate. His story reminds us that the human capacity for self-destruction can masquerade as the highest ideals, and that sometimes the most dangerous prison is the one we build for ourselves in the name of freedom.